Start. Hello and welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Larry Liu, and today I'm joined by Mike Buhl. Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Welcome. Thanks, Larry.
So today we're going to start this conversation with an image, which I hope in the final YouTube version, it's going to be visible if you only are into the audio, which is the Spotify and the SoundCloud version. Then I refer you to the YouTube version. But it depicts an image of two very muscular men that are doing the arm wrestling, and and on the left side, it says, quote, downwardly mobile, overeducated sociology majors who think service jobs are beneath them. And on the right side, it says tech senti millionaires who think anyone with an IQ of less than 130 is economically useless.
Mm.
And both of them converge
Yeah.
on the UBI, right? The universal basic income as a uh, program as a government policy. And of course, in this podcast, we've talked about UBI on and off. So, Isal, maybe before I comment on this,
Yeah. No.
maybe I'll
I,
ask Mike to jump in first.
uh, yeah. I think on the left side, sometimes people that are against UBI will claim that this is an academic project. People have their heads in the cloud, and also people that don't want to do service work uh, reject embrace UBI. And so I'm trying to think of this attitude towards UBI is often people that are very anti-intellectual. Maybe uh, they they themselves see the necessity for work and labor as a necessity, and instantly claim that this is a utopian project brought about by intellectuals. That's what that sociology majors and I guess people claim that people that are creating UBI or talking about it are just academics, which is not entirely false. I mean, there are a lot of academics involved in UBI debates. There's lots of academic publishing done on this area, but there's also real mobilization. There's real movements of UBI, at local areas, local levels being introduced. So I think it kind of stereotypes the assumption that it's just an academic project, dealing with intellectuals that don't want to do productive work or something, or service work, service, what Graeber calls BS jobs. Now, on the other side, I'm not quite sure. Maybe you can help me interpret that. I don't know what this means. Uh, People that aren't as smart. Is it Help me interpret the right side a little bit? I don't.
Yeah.
What are
So,
centimillion? What are centimillionaires? Maybe we'll start with that.
well, centi means 10.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
So basically, people who have more than $10 million, but maybe less than $100 million in net worth, which is quite a realistic figure for many of these, tech bros or people that start in Silicon Valley, becoming investors or starting businesses. And if they have a successful IPO, right, initial public offering, they might be able to sell their product to usually the big tech companies, like your
Yeah.
Alphabet and Meta and so forth. And then they become, multimillionaires overnight. And these are generally people who think of themselves as very smart. Yeah, and it cannot be completely denied, right? I mean, like you're not going to be, like a goofball if you develop, AI products. So there's definitely something to it. But it has a very Darwinian kind of logic to it,
Okay.
right? You're an economically useless class. Look, I developed the algorithm, it displaced your job, and I'm going to, give you a little bit of my wealth in the form of the UBI, so that you can survive and you won't be directing your anger against me for making you unemployed because of automation.
Okay. Something
And
like an AI dividend or something, but it's from the more affluent or richer genius.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then the downwardly mobile, overeducated sociology majors. I mean, now, and of course, we are getting triggered because we are sociologists. But you can insert like English major or
Arts.
yeah, the arts, kind of like
Uh,
basically all the social sciences outside of economics, kind of. And it is the case that there is some level of downward mobility, right? So it's not completely harebrained what they're suggesting in this image. There was the work by Peter Turchin and Jack Goldstone, two um, political historical sociologists, and they've tried to explain the structural, demographic, political bases for social revolutions that are happening. And oftentimes these revolutions come about because you have an overeducated population that is not capable of obtaining well-paid, high-status jobs.
oh.
Um, that's why I mean, like, if you look at the discourse right now that's happening along like immigration, there's too much undocumented migration that's coming across the border. And the flip side of that is that oftentimes the immigrants are taking the jobs that the natives don't want to work anyways.
Mhm, mhm.
And so if we stop the flow of immigration, including the undocumented version, you would have issues with basically every kind of um,
Construction jobs. Yeah.
yeah, construction jobs, agriculture, picking fruits. These are really like necessary jobs, you could say, at the bottom rung of the economy.
Mhm.
And if you are a college graduate, people of our tribe, you know, we 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 wouldn't be applying for these jobs. I mean, like I never applied for like a farm laborer job.
Same
Um,
here. I never. Yeah.
right. So there's definitely something to this argument about downward social mobility, and then you create a coalition of political forces that happen to advocate for the same policies, even though on many other topics they might have disagreements. Um,
Uh,
I so my assessment of this picture, I mean, is much less kind of cynical.
yeah. It.
Um, we're
Well,
strange bedfellows. That's all it is, right?
it kind of reminds me of the critique by Catherine Liu. Uh, Her critique of the professional managerial class. She wrote this book several years ago, claiming that like university kind of professors, you know, are actually located somewhere in the middle class if they're tenured, and they often have to play this game of signaling or engage in virtual signaling that they are kind of really for the little people or the people with working class interests, but they often also, are mingling with upper class people because they are in this position of status. So I could see a critique of the people in certain locations. They may message that they're working class friendly and they have working class interests, but their position is definitely, like in this status that's middle class if they're tenured, for instance. If they go to a prestigious, college, university where they're working. So I don't know. There's something there about certain professions. So yeah, we can't totally dismiss this claim that it's just an academic project, you know.
Right. So hypothetically, I mean, in your
Yeah.
version, I mean, if you're like a tenured professor, middle-aged
You
to
would
older,
like
you would
like
probably
for
be
instance,
against UBI. Is that the assumption?
well, like think of some academics that are proponents of UBI are themselves in a position that they don't have to worry about everyday, struggles. It's good that they're advocates for UBI, but they're at a different social class location, and so these are often like think of academic produced. You make publication, you're writing books. But working class people themselves could, really benefit. But that's why it's interesting that a lot of times if you think about UBI, it is an academic class, that has most of these debates. I mean, occasionally it enters into political parties. Remember Andrew Yang, and then even in Europe, the Green Party sometimes discuss it, but it's almost in academic circles, I would argue, um, and it has difficulty making it outside of academic circles or academic bubbles. Right?
Well, but
So,
that's
yeah,
why the image is so useful, right? Because it's not just
yeah,
the left side of the picture; it's also the right side,
right, right.
where basically you have a coalition of people that normally do not, see eye to eye on a daily basis. I mean, if you think about like, okay, well, who are the tech bros, the tech centimillionaires,
Mhm.
or even the billionaires, right? I mean, I'm always thinking about the Mark Zuckerberg example, right?
Yeah,
Where
Facebook.
yeah, Facebook. He sits in his dormitory. He codes up a web page where it allows him to hit on girls better, right? Because that's what Facebook was designed for, basically hitting on college girls more or less.
Yeah,
Um, a- and um, and then he kind of realized, well, actually, like if I finish my degree, right, like if I graduate on time and I was going to go work a regular job at a corporation, it would be a waste of my time because I actually have been able to design a website that generates much more traffic, much more revenues, and I don't have to follow the grimy, rationalized, bureaucratic logic. Uh,
9 to 5. Yeah.
yeah, the 9 to 5, which if you think about it, I mean, the education system is sort of inculcating, right? Like like what does it mean like if we as instructors give our students assignments, right? The fact that you have to submit your assignment by this deadline if you want to get a positive grade. um we are basically preparing these students to become professional workers, right? Who are able to complete assignments on time and be conscientious. Um, and versus like if you're like a tech bro, right?
Mm.
You know, i- like the ethos is different, right? Where they're saying, well, we're trying to break the rules. I'm much smarter than the average population, right? So there's certainly some
Like an
intellectual
innovative
hubris.
class, innovative class instead of the conforming class, creative
Yeah,
class that, yeah.
definitely. I mean, there's some hubris which you can observe here, and they're using uh, that you could say innovative capacity to kind of try to break some of those rules. And so I always think about like this Bourdieusian plane, right?
Mhm.
The cultural capital, the economic capital, right? And if you are a tech bro, I would uh, put you very high in the economic capital category, right? Because it's undoubtedly, I mean, if you have a massive IPO, raising tens of millions of dollars, you definitely made it in life. So you'd be very high in economic capital.
Lower
Um,
level, right?
yeah, so you'd be lower down the rank with respect to cultural capital.
Hmm.
And if you are a university professor, right, then it's reversed, right? So you're very high in cultural capital because you spend all of these years going through the school system. You read tons of books. You have maybe written books yourself. You publish many articles. So you're a very well learned person. Um, but y- but you're collecting a middle class salary, right? Like even if you're like at a tenured, at a reputable university, um, even at a good institution, I mean, you're in the lower six-figure realm, right?
Hmm.
I mean, if you're at a state university, I mean, within the social sciences and our field, I mean, you're still actually in the five-figure region, right? Um,
Yeah.
so we actually, I think you called it middle class. I mean, so I would say there's a
Give or take. Yeah.
range, right? So I think if you're maybe community college instructor, I think you're more in the precarious, maybe the low middle class. If you
Right.
are, you know, tenured at a big university,
70,000 probably, or more. 100,000.
well, I mean, if you're the top Ivy League institution, I mean, you would start at
Oh,
six figure. I mean, it's probably
yeah.
120,000 or something.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Then you would be kind of like upper middle class, right? Like if you're like a senior professor, I've seen like four or 500,000 is possible nowadays.
Yeah.
Um, but there's a limit to that as well, right? So you're probably not gonna go into the millions of dollars, because it's still you're still getting paid a salary, right? Still within the university employment contract. You're not receiving the income that the market is, could give you potentially if you signed up like millions of customers, right?
Mm.
Like in the tech world. So yeah, so basically along the two planes, you have the cultural elite, which are the people on the left of the image. You have the economic elite, which is the people on the right side of the image, and they're
Summary.
converging.
That's a good summary. Yeah, they're converging. Yeah.
They're converging, and that's why I mean, for me, this is. I mean, if you strip the sort of derogatory assumption about whatever liberal arts and so forth embedded in the picture, um, I actually endorse the overarching sentiment that you have two people in different factions who can converge in the same policy.
Mm.
Um, and then if you think about like, so if we had to create like a new image, right, with new labeling, whom would we put into the anti-UBI camp, right? Like, who are the people that are going to be um, saying that UBI is going to bankrupt us, right? Which is usually the fiscal conservative, economic
Libertarian.
elites.
I would say libertarians too, because they would fear the state management of UBI, or yeah, people that have a real rigid view, more market fundamentalists would be usually opposed to UBI. They would see UBI as a tool for redistribution, and state redistribution. That's the way I would see many people. Yeah, they would be anti-UBI. They would have a libertarian, maybe like a more of a, let the market run everything attitude. And people, again, I'm generalizing. People that may be more UBI, they think that UBI could be a form of redistribution besides just welfare, universal, not means tested, right? And it would be open to all. Uh, but yeah,
Yeah, that's
in
right.
summary,
But you could say
yeah.
that like there are like cultural and some economic elites, perhaps that would be anti-UBI, right? So uh, there are, a lot of people who are, like highly educated who think that, well, they've worked so hard and, they don't, feel like, they want to give up anything, right, to pay for a UBI. There are also people who are non-elites, right, who generally think that, nobody should be getting any welfare, right? It's sort of
Right.
like they want uh, people to be completely self-reliant, right? And there's a coalition of that as well, right? So of the um, certain segments of the cultural elite, certain segments of the economic elite, and then also the
Yeah.
non-elites, right?
So
And
it's definitely very divided in camps. So it's very difficult sometimes to really know who's for it or who's against it. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it really
I mean,
depends, like, what are the values that people have, and what is the evidence that they believe in, right?
mm,
So I mean, of course, I mean, if the assumption is that, everybody lays down the work at the same time, the economy collapses, nobody produces anything, if that were to come into fruition, then yeah, then UBI is a pipe dream. I mean, it would stop immediately before day one.
it's
Um,
something utopian, it's a utopian project.
Yeah, but then
Really
on the
amazing.
other hand, I mean, if the argument of those, two factions is correct, right? The cultural elites who cannot get jobs, and the tech bros that, think that they are automating all these jobs. If they are correct, right? Then, well, then it's the anti-UBI crowd that is foolish, right? Right.
Yeah.
So.
Mm,
Um, but ultimately, like, people are not necessarily going to support an agenda, um, you know, just for its own,
thank
um,
you.
sake. Yeah, I mean, it's like you sometimes, like, you have to implement a policy, like even if you don't know what all of the consequences are of the policy, but the only way how you know what the so-called equilibrium effect of a policy is by introducing it, and then you want to measure the economic, the social effects of these programs. Um, and sometimes it can become very confusing because, I mean, I've seen certain, like, cash income program, RCTs, the randomized controlled trials, where it kind of points in different directions. I mean, so some studies are now saying, oh, well, people are less likely to be working, and this is terrible.
Yeah.
There's other studies that say, there's no impact. There's other studies that say, increase in employment. Um, and I mean, I would generally say, like, if it's for certain categories of people that are working less, like, I mean, you think of, like, mothers with young children, right? Or think of, teenagers who might be going to school instead of, working or something like that. It is really quite complex, um, but the sort of argument that, Van Parijs delivers, I think, is quite powerful, right? Where for him it's all about, the individual freedom, right? It's
Yeah.
ultimately, it's about, like, I mean, he talks about, like, you know like the freedom of the surfer, right? Because the anti-UBI people are saying, well, why should I feed the lazy surfer, right? The guy who goes out on the beach and just tans himself in, like, while riding the waves. Um and Van Parijs argues that, even the lazy surfer has a right to eat effectively,
Mm,
right? Yeah, this. it's like the minimum capability that we have to give every person, and then they can build something on top of that. So I mean, you can think like the surfer, you know, like let's say if he captures himself riding the waves on camera, right? And then he puts it on, Instagram or YouTube or whatever, and he gets like millions of clicks. Well, guess what? Then the money's going to come in, and now he's going to basically, I mean, he's effectively a small business owner, right?
No. The
And
positive nature of having autonomy, and then people may take risks and they are not forced into certain kind of professions or jobs which they really dislike. So there's freedom
that's right.
potential, right? Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So hypothetically, so in a world where, let's say, the surfer, he does not come from a rich family, so he does not have family assets. So he would probably be, a consultant or, a teacher or, a firefighter or something like that. Where you might say, well, okay, these would be actually useful activities for the community. But then you could also say that, it was not the best use of his time because clearly, I mean, he wants to be surfing, right? That's the activity that, he feels like he has a calling to do. Um, and
Yeah.
in the world where you have more and more automation, it's like, well, why are we not opening up these doors, right, to more people?
I could add one more idea that UBI implemented up a multi-activity society, like that you wouldn't be constrained into one track and forced to go into this track, that it would open up multi-activities that even crosses the boundary what people used to think of as legitimate versus illegitimate work, or certain kinds of professions or jobs that are now paid for, or there's some compensation, public jobs, service jobs. So yeah, which is interesting because even thinking about things like sports, in modern society, there's professional sports, there's kind of recreational sports, and you know, uh, but it seems like only the professional sports and some college athletes, they sometimes make a career out of it, and they can make money out of it. But for the majority of people, sports is seen as something just recreational. Imagine if there was an opening up where more and more people could get paid employment to encourage recreation and exercise. I think UBI could be encouraging that multi-activity, you know, trajectories, where it's not just like a professional athletes that can make money off of sports, or Olympic athletes, then they get endorsements and then they get some money for their sports activity. So it can like trickle down almost. It could open up opportunities.
And even
Uh,
among athletes, I mean, you have social struggles around payment, right? So think of like
yeah.
college athletes, right? Where, I mean, I would say that, you know, they perform at a level that is pretty close to, kind of like the professional adult leagues, right? But it's still controversial for them to get paid, right? Even though, the universities, they are charging quite significant, entry fees, tickets to the public to watch these, um, you know, adolescent players. And then also, well, if you are not paying these college athletes, well, guess what? I mean, you're going to be paying these athletic directors at the universities millions of dollars. And I think in some universities, the highest paid employee is not the president of the university, but the football coach, right? Um, and
Yeah.
and you could see that there's an inherent injustice in that. Um, it's just reading the book by Cedric Robinson, the Black Marxism, and he kind of was one of the early people who talked about this concept of like racial capitalism, and basically the idea is that that the success of capitalism, the European version of it, is really built on slavery and colonial extraction. Um, because if you didn't have this kind of abundance of African labor brought into the colonies in North and South America, that you wouldn't have um, you could say the cheap production of those commodities that are in high demand, right? So tobacco and cotton and sugar and so forth. And you wouldn't have these markets that give the impetus to European companies to grow, right?
Hmm.
Because I mean, if you think about it, I mean, if your entire market was restricted to the land-based feudal economy of Europe, there's no impetus for investments, right? Because your market is going to be limited by that limited consumer pool. However, if you are able to expand your market into the new colonies, right? So into the Americas, and then also like then Asia, and then also like Africa and so forth. If you're able to expand into a world market, now you're going to have the impetus for your the European capitalist companies to to make more investments, to develop technologies to basically conquer new consumer markets, right? Um, and yeah, and it was all subsidized by the unpaid labor, which was slavery. Now, I mean,
Yeah.
there's a minimum payment that is required. So, because you have to feed the slaves as a slave master, which I mean, in the narrow Marxist economic lens, I mean, it's still the slaves that are feeding themselves, right? I mean, they're
Mm.
growing their own like cattle and growing their own corn and stuff.
But under super
Um,
exploitation, yeah,
yeah, it's
global
super
exploitation.
exploitation. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I mean, but yeah,
Th-
they would still have to feed themselves to some extent, right?
There's another book I recommend on this same topic. Max Haven wrote a book on palm oil, the history of palm oil, and this slave labor component that was utilized. And we now think of palm oil, I mean, it's still in a lot of products that we utilize. And he did this investigation of palm oil and its history, and it has this component of exploited slave labor that was used, and different regions of the world where palm oil is extracted, particularly the poor areas, I believe, Caribbean, and uh, parts of the world. But to this day, palm oil is, in all ingredients that we can think of. But it has this history, yeah, long history of with usage of slave labor. So Max Haven also has kind of written on this topic. I recommend it for our listeners.
And even today, I mean, I saw that it's being used a lot. So I believe that Indonesia
Yeah.
is one of those countries today that are one of the major producers of the palm oil that we're still inserting into our food chain. If you look at a lot of like biscuits, cookies, and stuff that contain the palm oil,
Yeah.
and the so it's not just about the human exploitation, right? Like the fact
Ecological.
that you need to labor, but also like think about the amount of land that has to be cleared in order to be able to have all of this palm oil available. Um, because the palm oil. Okay, so now I
Mm.
am a little
It's
bit
again
weak on the details here, but I mean, so the palm oil, I mean, is it extracted from
through
the
palm.
root of the tree?
think it's kind of, if I'm not mistaken, it grows almost like corn, and then they have to you cut it, uh, and then I think they beat it and extract it through burning it, and it was a very laborious process, and of course, highly profitable for European colonial powers. That's why there was a lot of interest in this palm oil ingredient, and it helped to, if you think about the industrial revolution, it was fully integrated in European markets. So, and we still have it. I mean, palm oil is still visible in a lot of ingredients. So, but I really recommend this book by Max Haven. He kind of goes and analyzes the history of palm oil and its, consequences for this uneven development between the global north and the global south too. I mean, it illustrates this unevenness. Yeah, it's called Palm Oil: The Grease of Empire. I think it was published several years ago. And there was a few podcasts that are circulating. You can listen to it for those people that like audio podcasts. So yeah, really recommend it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, and it's just a sign of like, also globalization, right? I mean, the fact that, I mean, we are, requiring, um, more and more parts of the planet to be under, human domination. There was another book that I'm reading to prepare for the contemporary sociological theory class. Yeah, it was by Saito. He's one of Kohei Saito, and he's a Japanese philosopher, and I think it was titled "Marx in the Anthropocene." So he's, a Marxist philosopher, but he's really playing with this idea that Marx formulated on what's called the metabolic rift.
Oh
And
yeah.
so then of course, I had to Google this term, and the basic idea is that we are pressing more and more resources out of nature for the sake of capital accumulation, but not realizing what the actual physical barriers are, the actual physical limits that nature imposes on us, right? Where, like the palm oil example, I mean, are you gonna, run out of palm oil at some point to extract? That's one possibility. Um, and the other thing is like, is the biosphere going to be so hostile to human life that that we put our own
Oh yeah.
existence into doubt?
Yeah.
Um, and that's the kind of metabolic rift that you know Marx originally talked about. Now, however, I mean, when this was written about in the mid 19th century, it was still, I would say, the earlier days of, you know, you could say globalization, industrialization, right? Capitalism. Um, and I would say that the climate indicators, they started to become really bad after the Club of Rome report, 1972.
Mhm.
Um, I would say probably around 1980s. I think that's kind of when it really took off. And yeah, I mean, we're sowing the seeds right now because like I don't know whether you follow like the wildfires, right?
Oh yeah,
It's in
yeah, it's happening.
uh,
California again, yeah. California.
yeah, in California. It's the entire West, right around the Rockies, also in Canada as well.
Yeah.
Um, and Yeah, because like there has been this discourse around the North, right? Like Canada, Siberia, right? These are going to be regions that will sustain us in the medium term if the rest of the world basically turns into ashes.
or uninhabitable. Yeah.
Yeah, uninhabitable. Yeah, I mean, I guess right now, I mean, it's like, yeah, I mean, if you are in, I think it was in South Asia, right? The heat waves that they have there, if you're Arabic Peninsula, it is already pretty rough there.
Mhm.
But then this idea, well, if we just all move up north, I mean, it just doesn't seem to be realistic because, I mean, even those regions have their own climate issues ongoing. Um, and I spoke with a Canadian friend recently, and he said that there's what's called the Canadian Shield, which makes it very hard to build cities, further up north.
Okay.
Uh, so a lot of the land is actually not very suitable for uh, construction and human populations. Um, because it's basically, I mean, because you cannot build straight on a rock formation, right? Um, you have to build on like soil, right? And if you have a huge amount of land that is a rock formation, you're gonna have issues with expanding. I'm not an expert in this. I mean, so if somebody wants
Neither
to
am I.
Google this and
W- what's surprising for me is even Greenland. I mean, Greenland, one would think there would be more people moving there and migrating to Greenland, but actually there hasn't been that much population growth in Greenland, even with this, more hotter weather and a possibility, this is a large amount of land in, Greenland. And I did have a few colleagues, one in particular went to Greenland and kind of studied in Greenland, just to study the villages and things like that. But that's surprising, that it's a lot more difficult than we thought. I mean, to move people into these spaces in the Nordic, areas, northern areas,
yeah.
including
um,
Greenland, if you ever look on the globe, I mean, Greenland is a big chunk, right beside Canada. So one would think there would be a movement of migration, but apparently no, not as much. So,
well, it might
uh,
still be a little bit early on, right? I
yeah,
think that as
maybe
time
in our
goes on.
lifetime. Yeah, in our lifetime, we'll see it with more and more hotter weather. Um, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that like it is, perhaps a temporary solution to be kind of going up further north, and maybe we can buy ourselves a little bit of extra time. But it is a little bit of a straw that we're kind of picking out on, and I don't know whether it's going to be that effective or successful in any case.
Right.
But okay, yeah. So you were mentioning earlier like sports. I don't know. Did you follow this like Olympic games at all?
I have occasionally tried to tune in. Um, yeah, I follow it like everybody else, yeah, that pretty much yeah, I'm just looking at the medal count and all that. I don't know what else. I should probably pay attention more. What about you? I don't know. Have you
Um,
followed Olympic?
yeah, I have not followed it too closely. I mean,
Okay.
yeah,
Uh,
it's like the Euro Cup. The Euro Cup final was the main one to follow, and that's
yeah, that's what I watched.
Spain won
Yeah.
against England.
Yeah, Germany got defeated really early. And Austria too, right? Yeah, Austria, I believe.
Yeah, well they were kicked out, I think, in the last 16 round. And yeah, but it's great to have the Olympics happening. For countries to come together and and to compete at that level. Um, there are some concerns regarding the safety of Paris because I think that like the trains were shut down for a while, right?
Oh
There've
yeah,
been like various kinds of cyber attacks against the critical
strikes, right?
infrastructure.
Yeah. Yeah, there
Uh,
was a sabotage of the railway tracks. Yeah.
yeah,
And
sabotage in the railway
also
tracks.
union union strikes at some of the hotels. Yeah, there was some union activity regarding hotels. So yeah, there was some. I heard some chaos before the opening ceremony.
Well, yeah, the
Uh,
labor action wouldn't be too surprising to me. I mean, this is after
yeah,
all France, right?
80%, I think, in a union. I think something like that. Correct
Yeah,
me if I'm wrong.
so yeah, so I'm no, I wouldn't be too surprised about that at all. Uh, but it is quite concerning that if you have um, the critical infrastructure that can be targeted, because you have because I've got this grant funded research project. We were looking at cybersecurity and interviewing like local residents around awareness around cybersecurity. And right as we were doing it, I mean, you had this big news with CrowdStrike,
Oh
which
yeah,
is
yeah.
this cybersecurity company that has essentially added um, a feature, like a bug into the program, and that resulted in the malfunctioning of the servers. And people were stranded. They couldn't fly for like a day or two, right? Were stranded in airports. People couldn't check into the hotels, right?
Mm.
Um, and so it's like bank access was curtailed for some people for some time. Um, the reputation of a cybersecurity company is going to be tarnished, right?
Yeah. I think it reflected in their stock price too, right? It wasn't it substantial loss of stock price, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, yeah, that's
Well,
right. Yeah.
financial penalty too, yeah. Just to mention, when this happened, this failure of this uh, internet, I guess, failure. My brother happens to work for another airline. I'm not going to mention the name of the airline, but a lot of the other airlines had really advanced, kind of upgraded their program and software. But this particular airline had older software, which actually benefited them. They didn't have this problem. But a lot of the newer airlines, apparently, because they had everything upgraded, and then this happened, this bug went into the
Oh, I
upgrade,
did read about that. It's Southwest Airlines. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I thought that was interesting. Actually, the older technology rescued us. So sometimes don't always trust the newer version, newer technology. Uh, I thought but that also reflects this monopoly of one major kind of company that perhaps has too much of a stake or control, and maybe there needs to be more diversification so it's all not dependent on just one provider. Logically that would make sense to me, that there would be some ways to you know uh, spread out the workload or have different subsystems. Again, I'm not an expert in this area, but I would think that would make sense. If you don't just have it all vested in one company that's responsible for it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's always this issue of like the first mover advantage, right? So if you are the first mover in a field, you're just going to
Dominate.
attract most of the business, right? You have the best reputation, right? Nobody wants to go with the second best service, right?
Yeah.
And but then, of course, if something like that happens, like a bad event, then you could lose all of your clients all at once, right? But then that also assumes that there's an alternative, right? And the issue in cybersecurity is that so you have this so-called ransomware, right?
Mm,
Where you have these hackers, they're just coming in, they're stealing the data from these companies, like including patient data in hospitals or client data in financial companies and so forth. And then they're saying, well, okay, if you pay us, whatever, $10 million or something, right? Then we'll return you the data, right? That's what this would the point of the ransomware.
mm,
And many companies, I think they kind of price that into the cost of doing business, right? Where they're saying, well, okay, we're willing to give up a few $1 million so that we can get our data back. And but then the counter argument that comes from the government is that if you allow yourself to be blackmailed in this way, they're going to come back the next day and steal the data again. Now, I mean, at that point, like if the data has been returned, you could say, well, okay, then you hire the cybersecurity team, or you tell the cybersecurity team to create new defenses against, the cybersecurity theft. But is it going to work, right? I mean,
no,
like,
always a risk.
yeah, I mean, are these same cyber hackers going to come back again? They're going to try it again. And so generally, I mean, so when what the government would be doing at that point, I mean, like they're not going to prohibit companies from paying the ransom, but they're going to say, you're going to have to notify us first, right? So there's a central notification system. But then the government itself, I mean, like, what are they going to do? I mean, like, are they going to like create their own like cybersecurity teams that are going to help protect the corporate secrets? So I don't know. It's a highly complex issue where anybody who works within the cybersecurity field, um, they seem to be having a good time because they know that that their business is guaranteed, right?
Yeah.
Um, and
Contracts and everything, yeah. Yeah, long term.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But then also like there's this big question about like this this back end risk society, which is
Oh yeah. Oops, back.
to what extent are we over reliant on these centralized systems to basically do anything? I mean, like to do our online banking, to do to log into the like Blackboard, Canvas, for educational materials, logging into our Google Drives because it's where we put all of our files nowadays.
Over dependency almost. We're forced into like, you know, adapting or using such technology. There's two come to mind when I think of back. You know, the manufactured risk, which I think this would fit in perfectly, you know, manufactured risk. The other is the boomerang effect idea he had. With technology, there's always this uncertainty component, and it can come back like a boomerang to bite you. So I wondered on the one hand, it makes sense that a lot of companies rely on just security companies, but on the other hand, it doesn't mean security, it doesn't necessarily mean zero free risk. There's still a degree of risk. So yeah, that would fit really well with the whole risk society thesis that we're entering into uncharted waters with the amount of things that are uncontrollable, including technology risks. Yeah. So I think there's two: the manufactured risk idea that we actually are often in the process of manufacturing risks. That's what I think. That's what Beck meant. We are the way our institutions are set up, our economy is set up. There's more challenges for control and regulation of those institutions. So it's so complexity. But on the other hand, there's also this boomerang effect, like with climate problems. the foods that we eat, that are really toxic, the cities, how our cities are developed, lack of planning, resource waste. I think those topics are modern day problems that we can easily define as risks. So yeah, makes Beck more and more relevant, I think. Even though he's been dead for 10 years now, I think, almost 10 years. Yeah. So his ideas are still relevant, including others. I mean, it wasn't just Beck. I mean, Anthony Giddens also kind of explored this idea of risk a little bit. To some extent, even Zygmunt Bauman, I mean, he kind of went into this area of modernity and the Holocaust. I mean, there's some aspects of risk there. So I'm not saying it's a perfectly idea accredited just to one author. There's different thinkers. Even to some extent, George Ritzer, McDonaldization, it has a kind of risk question mark in the background, right? So yeah, there's some good books to read, put on one shelf if we have time to read them all, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, risk is definitely, I think it pervades, um, you know, our lives. I mean, kind of modern existence is entirely, risk laden, and we cannot escape it ultimately. I mean, I think the people that are relatively the more resilient are the ones who could survive if they were moving off the grid, right? So if you had like actual like survival skills, that is to say, like if you know how to take a rifle or a spear or something and you can stab, you know, like your food, right? The hunt the
Chickens
wild
in
game.
chickens in your little farm that you have a little farm and grow some tomatoes, your little off the yeah.
That's
Very
right.
few.
Yeah.
Yeah, that could be possible. Yeah, make your own food system. Yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah.
if you know how to sustain your basic necessities, right? And you don't rely on the centralized systems, right, to supply you with the things that you need. I think you have, relatively speaking, as an individual, you have the most survival skills. Um, but to some extent, I mean, it's not very realistic either, because I mean, we know that.
Thoreau, right? What was the guy's name?
Yeah,
Thoreau.
yeah.
Uh,
Well, there's a comfort in living in an industrial society, right?
right, right.
It's like, like when I sit outside, because we've got some AC issues at home now. And so and you sit in the veranda, and it's like, oh yeah, you read the newspaper, everything is cool. But then you get hit by these mosquitoes, because I tend to attract them.
Yeah,
And then you're like, okay, you're reminded again, okay, this is the comfort of civilization, that you're able to stay indoors most of the time. And in this office, I mean, I don't get attacked
mosquitoes.
by mosquitoes over here, right? And so, to some extent, I've forgotten how, you know, life in nature, actually has been, right?
Mm.
Um, but I mean, I still go hiking like at least once a
Good.
week.
Yeah.
Um, and oftentimes, like when you go out, I mean, especially during the warmer time, like right now, like you always hear the mosquitoes flying by, right? Because it'll always be very close to your ears, right?
Yeah.
And so then
Especially in
they're
Texas,
there.
when it rains, we have a severe mosquito problem where they have to spray at night because of some diseases that spread too. The West Nile virus, they have tested for it. So some of this humidity causes increase of mosquitoes. And when we have a lot of these, like uncertain heat waves and rains that are happening more abnormal, we have an increase of insects. So it's actually, yeah, it's a concern. So these mosquitoes, they spread diseases, you know.
Have you
It's
had like
surprising.
documented cases of
Yeah,
like
yeah, we
West
had
Nile
West
virus?
Nile virus located here in Dallas County and in I believe Tarrant County. There was several cases of people actually getting West Nile virus through a mosquito. So it's not funny. I mean, it's a real thing. Now, but I think it's more for vulnerable populations, elderly people in particular. But
Yeah, I know with the global north countries, I mean, normally the way how, like, for instance, they learn about malaria cases is usually from returnees, people who traveled to regions that have malaria and then
mhm,
they get
bring it
infected
home.
and then they bring it back home.
Yeah,
And then, in the airports, you usually have these big signs that say, well, you should watch out for if you have those symptoms and, you should report to your doctor and so forth.
yeah.
But, but if you start to have the so-called tropical diseases, and if they are starting to spread even in the global north countries, I think
Okay,
that's going to
that's
be
a concern.
a major game changer, right? Because it just suggests that um, you could say an environment that is more hostile for humans, effectively, right?
Mhm.
And I mean, if you look at the history of human deaths, uh, I think mosquitoes are number one, right? It killed the most
Oh yeah.
people.
Oh,
Um,
no, I can see it. Yeah.
and then I think the second ranked is like humans themselves because we fight wars and stuff. So that's another way, and also like homicide and suicide and so forth.
Yeah.
So
So yeah, yeah. Good.
but certainly, I mean, the mosquitoes would be at the top. So it absolutely makes sense to be vigilant.
Oh yeah.
About mosquitoes. But I spoke with a colleague. He's from Kenya,
Mhm.
and he says that like so where his family's from, like in the highlands of Kenya, it's not so problematic. It's somewhat drier up there, right? Um, but if you are close to like these big lakes, right? Like river water and very close to the sea level, um, then you have massive issues because in temperate climate regions, like usually in the winter and spring, fall, it would get cool enough that those mosquitoes are not able to hatch their eggs, right? Or they would kind of, well, they would exist, but they would be dormant. I think that's what it is.
Yeah. But now
Um,
it's not the case, huh?
Yeah, but if you're in a tropical climate, so I mean, never cools below a certain temperature, right? Which means that they'll always be able to hatch their eggs, and the mosquitoes will always be there. And and then if you spray the insecticide, I mean, you have to consider the cost benefit of that operation, right? Where it's like, okay, you're spraying too much insecticide, it's gonna seep into the groundwater, it's gonna seep into the rivers. Your people are drinking basically, chemical fertilizer laced water, right? So they get all kinds of diseases and cancer with that, right? And also, and, 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 and unless you kill every single egg, um, like, it's like you are just, you know, trying to, stop a raging fire with like a tiny bucket of water, right? Um,
Yeah, which is quite interesting. I want to share something. In Texas, there's an entire like industry that caters to this mosquito problem. And people, what they do is they buy these electric zappers that you hang, and the mosquito goes to the light and it zaps them. Another one is these entrapment techniques. They have a kind of liquid that you pour in, and then it smells like poop. But now these are for outside. And then the mosquito smells the poop and has to go in there, but it gets stuck, right? So what I find ironic is in the West, in the Western world, people have these techniques to kill the mosquitoes, and there's an entire retail industry. Everything from the tapes, the people tape it, these bug tapes. But imagine, like people with low income, limited needs. I mean, how do you fight it? And like you would have to spend a proportion of some of your money on this insect fighting. It can get expensive, Uh, but in the West, we have this, I guess, mentality. We can just buy the bug zapper, or the right, the thing that we spray on our, skin, all sorts of chemicals we use for the mosquito problem, Uh,
Yeah, well, I mean that's
yeah,
kind of the pro-capitalistic argument,
yeah,
right? Where I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
if you follow Björn Lomborg, he's
Okay.
one of those contrarian voices in the global climate change discourse,
Mhm.
and he basically argues that what is killing more people in the global south are the effects of poverty rather than like straight up climate change.
Yeah.
And the way to counteract, let's say, diseases, malnutrition, but also things related to climate damage. Um, I was thinking of the example of Guyana, where they've been kind of like a lower income country,
Mhm.
mostly living off of like rice production and bauxite mining. And over the last 10 years or so, maybe even 5 years, they shifted to petroleum and oil and gas production, which they
Mhm.
then export to the global market. And now, the government of Guyana, they start talking about creating these coastal barriers and coastal defenses, where, you know, this is all part of the climate resilience strategy because, as a coastal nation,
They're worried
where
about it.
most of
Yeah.
the population is living close to the coast, right? That, you know, part of this climate resilience strategy is to invest in these coastal barriers. But
Mhm.
only now they have got the resources to do it because they're selling all of this oil.
Yeah.
Um,
It's
and then,
crazy when you think about it. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, because there's this irony where I think it was a BBC journalist who says the president of Guyana, Irfan Ali, why are you, emitting 2 billion extra tons of CO2 into the atmosphere indirectly, of course, because it's Guyana that sells the oil to the other countries, and the other countries are burning it. Similar to the Norwegian model, right? The Norwegians, I mean, they consume a tiny fraction of the Norwegian oil.
Mhm.
Most of the oil money that the Norwegians generate is by selling it overseas. Um, and the Norwegians, I think they have the highest per capita usage of electric cars in the world. So they're not the ones who have to consume most of the electricity. Sorry, but most
That
of the
it
petroleum.
definitely represents this uneven development, problem, or asymmetry, both on a production, consumption, and lifestyle. So it's a dilemma. I mean, even in the US, think of people who can afford a Tesla or a electric vehicle. It takes 60,000, 70,000. The Cybertruck being produced in here in Texas, in Austin, I think, and it's also about 100,000. So those that can afford it, they have to have a certain income bracket. It's very unaffordable. And then the people that cannot afford it, they have to go with the regular gas car. So, right. So it's a
Yeah,
dilemma. Lifestyle, it's interesting that those that need it the most are priced out of it, and those that really don't need it or should, have it, they acquire it much easier. That would be my argument. It's a kind of interesting way to look at it from a
yeah, but again, on
consumption.
on, on the
Yeah,
Lombard argument, I mean, it's a very
yeah,
big question. Like, there, whether you can make this climate justice argument without also
yeah,
taking into account the economic well-being argument, right? That it's
yeah.
it's it's oftentimes that the fact that you have a higher GDP, that you can invest more into climate resilience, right? It's not just that the higher GDP is causing an increase in the CO2, which is also true,
Right.
right? I mean, there's definitely a historical correlation, right, between the CO2 and the GDP. But then if you have a low GDP, I mean, you'd be screwed first, right?
Yeah.
So you do have to go into, you have to think economic development together with environmentalism. We don't seem to have an
Get the
opening
get a,
to go a different route at this point.
yeah.
And
Also, the population differences. I mean, demographically, isn't it like the global South makes up 80% of the world's population, and the global North is only 20%? I mean, that's already, asymmetry there just by the population and the resource, differences there. Yeah. So, yeah, I see it. Yeah. Uh, it's a can of worms. Yeah, definitely.
yeah, and then and then of course then we go back to the topic of migration
Yeah.
again because
Yeah.
it's new
Uh,
kind of
uh,
worms that get opened because in a way, if you have, the demographic and the economic imbalance together and the climate change imbalance, right, where the poorer countries have less means to adjust to the climate change world. If you take all of these factors together, then it would be a surprise if migration to the global north would remain low. Actually, I expect that more and more people are going to try to seize the opportunity to move to a global north country. Um,
mm, makes sense. Yeah.
there just is like this, comparison of global living standards today, where you can no longer hide the standard of living differentials between the rich and the poor countries. Um, and again, there's certain conditions that make it very much intolerable to live in the poorer countries. It's not just climate change. I mean, you also have extremely, corrupt, like low quality governments. You
Mhm.
have, um, in Central America, I mean, you've got issues of um, gang violence. Quite
Yeah.
frankly, I mean, you basically have, you walk on the
Cartels, right?
street,
You get shot
pick
and
up
killed.
groceries, and you might get shot, right, by the gangs who might be fighting each other at that time. So yeah, and so I mean, if you have like a lack of security, I think that this would be a factor to its to its migration. Um, and I just saw the Economist article where they were saying that there is a kind of like, well, I mean, it's a within global North discourse, right, of closing the borders, right, that that we went too far in one direction, right, that right now, I mean, if you have basically a stagnation of the domestic born population, right, you have a massive increase in the foreign born population, and we see this across all most of the global North countries. So like France, Germany, UK, US, Canada, Australia, kind of like the most popular destinations is also where you're seeing the highest pressure to migrate. Um,
Mm.
and yeah, and also like the the popular discourse is also shifting very, very strongly to its thinking of migration as a salient topic, right?
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Especially
um,
among the right, in most political systems around the world, it seems the right really likes this topic. Yeah, weaponized it. Yeah,
yeah, I
yeah.
mean that and
Definitely in
but
France
then
and Germany and U.S. Yeah.
yeah, I mean it's difficult to resolve by itself, because there is, again, there's these objective factors that well, that then becomes subjectively relevant for these actors, for these migrants, who are then saying, well, it's just not acceptable for me to to live in this location. Um,
Struggle for survival, right? Struggle for survival.
yeah, but then okay, then the other argument is, well, what about the rich country citizens, right? They're basically saying that they have a right to define the boundaries, right? Like the fact that they are the insiders, well, they get to decide about who can become an insider and who has to remain an outsider, right?
Mm,
I
yeah,
mean, you see this logic everywhere, right? I mean, if you're trying to apply for a job, right? I mean, are you the insider or are you the outsider, right? I mean, if you're the applicant, you're always the outsider, so you have the
yeah.
least amount of power, really. I mean,
The selection process, Yeah.
yeah, and so if you are already an insider, then you would say, well, okay, you want to make the inclusion criteria very, very restrictive, right?
Mm.
Because you feel like you're going to be diluting your own privileges if you open up too much.
I think
Um,
Stefan Mao calls this machine the filtering machine. This immigration machine is a filtering mechanism. I'm trying to remember the German word that he used to describe it, but yeah, that's what immigration politics is. It's like a filtering system. Tries to filter this idea of filtering.
yeah. So in
Yeah, great.
hypothetical worlds, like if you had
Yeah,
like completely open borders, right? So
yeah,
you don't mean anybody who wants to can afford a flight ticket or can drive across the border. If you were to allow that to happen, like the the resources of the rich countries in the short term, I mean, it is going to be catastrophic, actually. Because I
mhm,
mean, if you think about like any city in the US, right? I mean, all the infrastructure that we built is designed for the population of that size, right? So, like in Baltimore, we might have like, I don't know, 550,000 plus, the Baltimore County, maybe like 1.3 million or something, right? So over here, I mean, we have an infrastructure that is set up for just about that population. Now, if you gradually add population, as a city planner, I mean, there's a way how you can go about this, right? I mean, you're going to add, a certain number of roads, you're going to add a certain number of
yeah.
houses and shopping
Schools.
malls and schools and all these. So you plan your way into the growth. Now, however, if I kind of say snap the finger and then overnight we basically abolish all the passports in the world, um
Mhm,
and people would be streaming from the poor to the rich. I mean, it would be absolute chaos because the infrastructure that we have even in the rich countries is not going to be able to handle
yeah,
this sudden overnight transition. um Now, in the long term, I mean, is it going to
possible.
be this economic equilibrium, where, I mean, the idea behind equilibrium is like basically that the income differences between the rich and the poor countries will go down to zero, basically.
Yeah. Uh,
And
Go ahead. I would
that is
use the
possible.
East German, West German example. I mean, when the border fell, there was a massive migration from East Germany, of people resettling West Germany. And like you said, I mean, the East German infrastructure, there were a lot of empty houses and factories were abandoned, and everybody kind of migrated over to West Germany to seek employment. There were still people that were living in East Germany at that time, but it overwhelmed the West German part of Germany, and moved all of the you know, economic institutions back over to the West, which took a long time to reintegrate all of Germany. To this day, there's this divide between East Germany, you know, uh, and West Germany to this day. I mean, there's still differences of income and right infrastructure, even though they poured a lot of money into it. You know, lots of money, infrastructure projects and things like that. But
Yeah, and there was another
yeah,
point that was
yeah,
raised by Gregor Gysi, the
oh
left-wing
yeah,
politician,
they go
um,
easy.
where he basically says that the West could not stop winning, right? And I guess what he meant by that is like the hubris that the West Germans had, because so if you look at like the high level positions, right? Like think of like the university jobs where they were pushing out the East Germans, and they were accusing them of having links with Stasi, which is the
Yeah,
state security services and whatever else. Um, pushed them into early retirement or whatever, and then replaced the high level officials, the high level civil servants, um, in the East with West Germans, right? So there's quite a substantial number of these the so-called West German transplants. Um, and and then okay, so from the labor surplus perspective of West Germany, I think that's great. That's good news, right? Because if you have, let's say, too much unemployment in kind of like middle class positions, right? You export your unemployment to these East German regions, by sending your people over there to fill those jobs. Uh, but then for the East Germans themselves, I mean, it's kind of like, well, okay, where are we standing, right? What are
mm-hmm.
our opportunities? Um, and then the other interesting thing I found was about the gender balance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, it turns out that the East German women were much more geographically mobile than the East German men. And I might say, well, the differences are, a couple of percentage points, but I believe that it is significant enough whereby you have, like in the districts where the AFD was doing extremely well,
Mm-hmm.
there might be sort of like a gender skew more towards the male side. Um,
Or employment, mean,
yeah, well, I
or
mean,
unemployment
for the
even.
population, right?
Yeah.
And because yeah, again, there were more East German women that were geographically mobile, which means that they were more willing to move to the West where the jobs are.
Mm-hmm.
And then and so that's, I think, also this issue of like, okay, feeling left behind, right? Where it's like, okay, you feel left behind because now,
Yeah.
maybe the
Resentment.
marriage pool is going to be smaller, right? Something like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and, and,
Definitely. Yeah.
and then maybe kind of like the right wing messaging might become more salient, right? Much more important, right?
Yeah.
So
It's
um,
easily done. Yeah. Through political messaging to try to acquire this vulnerable population that needs a scapegoat, needs some political, way to communicate their frustration, and then the AFD just uses the sentiment to try to acquire the votes and blame the establishment parties, for their misery. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think
yeah,
that's what the French sociologist Didier Eribon, I think this video that I was sharing on Facebook with you personally, uh, he is a product of Pierre Purdue. I believe he was a student of Pierre Purdue, and he did books where he goes back to his own uh, coming up in France in his own family, and he observes his own parents who used to be kind of left-wing voters and used to vote kind of the union vote, and all of a sudden became right-wing voters. And he goes back and tries to look at the structures and the circumstances that turned a lot of these left-wing rule voters to right-wing voters that supported, this more nationalistic kind of vote. So even in places like France, there's a change in rural areas and areas among working class people who start to vote for conservative parties with populist kind of messaging. So there's like two books he actually wrote. The more recent one he wrote about his mother, and it was actually quite interesting. He does a kind of autoethnography, if you like, or something like a
Well, the mother had some kind of love affair
yeah,
with a person that she met in the supermarket after her husband passed away, right?
yeah,
And then and then when that new boyfriend split up with her, then she passed away, right? That was kind of the the
yeah.
sad ending for
I
for
think
his
so.
mother, right?
Yeah, the title of the book. There's a podcast I was listening to. Now this is in German. The Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. They had a podcast with him. I don't know when the English translation will be out, but the title of it currently is "A Worker Life, Working and Dying," and he was describing his mother's life from being a worker, you know, from being a woman, struggling, and ultimately ending up in a nursing home where he noticed all these conditions horrible for older people, particularly, horrible conditions, and then she ended up, I believe, dying in the nursing home. But it was like a portrait for his mother. So it's at first very unusual. I was kind of like, okay, why is he focusing on his own mother? But then it started to make sense. He's trying to construct a narrative, trying to explain the hidden injuries of class, particularly for uh, working class people, particularly women in this particular case. But then he also has the first book that he wrote. It was called Return to Reims. I hope I pronounced the town, where he goes back to his own childhood and he tries to go back to the village where he grew up and later, surprisingly, becomes a social study, I think he goes to Paris, he becomes a student of Pierre Perdue, and surprisingly changes his life trajectory. I mean, he could have easily become a working class person himself, but he becomes a member of this academic cultural elite, right? Then he looks back at his own uh, reflection of this time when he was growing up in this small rural French uh, town that converted, that went to right wing voters. That I mean, they became right wing voters, and he's trying to locate the source of this, of poverty and uncertainty, dissatisfaction with the left parties. So yeah, this is a very interesting sociologist. He kind of is a Vance equivalent to the Hillbilly Elegy book by Vance, the current vice president
Yeah.
candidate for Trump. It's a kind of French version to this, but this is in the French uh, periphery, if you like,
Yeah, so there's
French.
a concern that,
Yeah,
the culture left might be kind of out of touch, with the
yeah,
working class
exactly.
concerns. Right. I mean, like, I mean, even in the Olympics, right? I mean, they have like they celebrate transgender performers, and for which, I mean, like, so for us, I mean, like, if you're kind of like university educated, you're kind of like, well, okay, what's the big deal? I mean, it's
Yeah,
fine to celebrate diversity in terms of gender, race, and so forth. Um, but I think if you are coming from this kind of like like white working class setting, um, that's kind of what you don't want to see, right? I mean, and also like I don't think it's so much like this internal bigotry that's driving people so much. I think it's more that so there's a perception that the things that they think as being more important
Mhm.
than, like ethnic diversity and so forth.
Economic
Like,
economic
yeah,
problems
it's
or
the
something.
economic stuff, right?
Yeah,
They
bread and
feel like
butter.
the
Yeah.
politicians, they stop caring about the economic agenda. Because ultimately, I mean, the economic agenda is kind of the neoliberal one, right? And so, I mean, the neoliberal agenda basically says that, you have to, like, learn and relearn, right? So if you lose your job, you should, study, you should get a degree, you should, whatever, get some special skills, so that you can join the same professional class as the, like university professors and the computer programmers and so on and so forth. And it's a very tone deaf analysis. I mean, I noticed within my own family, right? I mean, like, certainly my parental generation, so it's not just my parents, but like, all of the others within the family. I mean, I don't have like a lot of university educated people within the family, right? So I mean, it has this very tone deaf nature to say to working class people, like, you that you have to obtain a college degree, right? And then, of course, and then if we go back to how we started the conversation with the picture, right, where the underemployed sociology graduates, right,
Do, do you
it
think that
doesn't work anyway.
explains why working class people are more likely to have this anti-intellectual sentiment? Because they think of intellectuals as being distant. They don't really are not part of us. They think too much. They work too little. They're thinking all the time. That there's more of an anti-intellectual sentiment among working class people because they think there's a disconnect.
Yeah, well,
And
that's the narrative that's been constructed by the right wing populists,
mm,
leaders,
mm,
and then the followers of those movements. I think they will lap it up, right? Which means they will accept the narrative. Um, but that's why, I mean, I would, that's why, like, to turn from, like, Trump, Vance, to
yeah,
somebody like Bernie Sanders, I think that's why that transition is very important, right? Because if you remember, there were so many of these, white working class base that was, pro Sanders and pro Trump, right? So, and I believe that, so if there was a real choice, right, if they had Sanders on the ballot in the Democratic Party, which of course did not happen, but if there was, that they would have sided with Sanders over Trump, and and then if you listen to Sanders' messaging, right, which is to say that, we might not agree on certain cultural viewpoint issues, think of like abortion, think of guns, but is there like intersection, right,
mhm,
that we have, right? So the intersection clearly is the economic agenda, right? To say that, you know, basically that you're going to have to start, soaking the rich, and then you also have to, create government jobs and, the public investments in, like underinvested, under-resourced communities, including both communities of color as well as, for the white working class. And if you had an agenda that was as broadly construed as that, I think that this, like,
yeah,
this could have turned things around, and basically prevented this, kind of like this right wing populistic slide,
yeah,
um,
makes sense.
in U.S. politics. Um, and yeah, so if people feel like that they're not part of the society, then they're going to be more receptive to the right wing messaging. And I know this to be um, the case that, if uh, they had, yeah, somebody like Big Bernie Sanders, I mean, more left wing economic agenda, I think it would, um, it would be more attractive. Um, but then I don't know. So like, but then how should we then analyze like the British elections, for instance, right?
Yeah.
Where
Well, there's Tory dominance for what, 12 years, 13 years?
yeah, about 14
They,
years, yeah,
yeah,
since
14, yeah.
2010. Um,
So plus
and
Brexit and all that. There are a variety of issues in the UK that public was virtually very upset, as far as I understand.
yeah,
Yeah, but
it's
yeah,
quite sad message actually because you remember, so there was a left-wing agenda, right? It was a Jeremy Corbyn agenda, and he
mm,
was basically, booted off, because he lost, two elections in a row, and then then you had the centrists, Keir Starmer, right? I mean, well, he started as being part of this, Corbyn agenda, but that was only so that he could be in the shadow cabinet. But then when he became the leader, he dropped the mask and he was like, "No, I'm actually a moderate."
mm,
He received fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn, right? Um, at least the first time I think that Jeremy Corbyn was elected, but maybe even the second time. And yet he won the election. So how can you win an election with fewer votes than before? And so in the British electoral system, I mean, it's all about the voter turnout. So
mm,
yeah, basically, if you have a lower voter turnout for your own party, but the other party has an even lower turnout, right? So yeah, I think the Tory party went from like 14 million votes to 7 million votes. So they lost half of the voters,
yeah,
right? Versus the Labour Party went from like 10 million to 9.5 or something like that, right? Then you can still win an election, even with fewer votes. And so within the British electoral system, I mean, it's not so much that Keir Starmer was going out of his way to increase the voter turnout for the Labour Party. What he was doing was he was signaling to the conservative voters that number one, it's okay for you to stay at home, so to not go voting at all. And number two, that it's okay for you to vote for the Reform Party, which was the Nigel Farage, the kind of the right wing party, right?
yeah.
Um, and
Eurosceptic,
Farage,
right?
yeah, I mean Farage, I mean he only took 10 seats, out of whatever the 650 or so, um, because his party was the second or the third most popular party within each constituency. Like you have to be number one in order to gain a seat.
Yeah. First past the post. Yep.
First past the post. That's right.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and so because of that, I mean, so it's the peculiarities of the British electoral system where it's signaling to the Labour Party, look, you can only win if you can push down the Tory vote,
Mm,
not by increasing the Labour vote. Because remember when Jeremy Corbyn was elected in the first time in 2015, and there was, based off of the rule change of Ed Miliband, that was the predecessor to Corbyn. Because Ed Miliband said that if you pay £3, which is a nominal fee, then you can join the Labour Party. Anybody in the UK could join the Labour Party by paying the £3.
mm,
And then because of that, there was a massive spike in the Labour membership. And that's how Corbyn got elected. And when Corbyn was elected as a leader, the membership numbers and the voter base of the Labour Party both increased, right?
Yeah.
But it didn't help because now there was a really high voter turnout for the Conservatives.
So yeah. You think that
Um,
was that Brexit vote too? That Brexit helped to give them a conservatives boost in voting turnout? The Brexit issue, that sort of,
yeah, um,
yeah.
but- but-
Unfortunately, I mean, for the EU, I guess.
yeah. So the,
Yeah.
the issue with Brexit is that it definitely made the electoral choice much more complex because you have to consider that at that time in 2019, the Labour Party under Corbyn was split, right? So you had the Europhile faction within the Labour Party. They were saying that we should have a second referendum. And then you have the Eurosceptics, which includes Corbyn. But then Corbyn himself, he was like, well, okay, he doesn't ultimately care that much about Europe. So he was okay with the second referendum, which was the proposal of the Europhile Labour Party, right?
Mhm.
And the Lib Dems, which is the third party, I mean, they were
Yeah.
strongly pro EU, so they wanted the second referendum for sure. Um, and then you have the Conservative Party, who was pro Brexit. And then you had the Brexit Party, which was a Nigel Farage outfit back then. Now it's called Reform UK. Um, but even the Reform UK was saying, no, the Brexit Party was saying that you know it's okay to support the Conservative Party because the Conservative Party at that time under Boris Johnson they were in favor of Brexit. So then what ended up happening was that well the Conservatives they won a blowout election, right? Because they were able to unite the Brexit vote. I mean, the Brexit vote, I mean, is about 45 to, I mean, it's a little bit less than 50%, but I mean, about 45% of the electorate. However, I mean, the Remain camp, you were splitting them up, right? Because you had the Green Party, you had the Labour Party, and the SNP in Scotland,
Mhm.
you had the Lib Dems, right?
Fragmented the
Um,
vote, huh? Yeah.
yeah, so the Conservatives were able to consolidate that vote. And that's why it was very interesting when Tony Blair, I mean, he gave a speech on this issue. He was saying to Jeremy Corbyn to not accept the terms of the snap election. But I mean, Corbyn's perspective was, I don't care, just give me the general election because I think I can win with my messaging.
Hmm. Didn't work, huh?
Yeah, it didn't work because at that point, I mean, in 2019, there was nobody who was talking about, whatever left wing agenda he had in mind.
Hmm.
Um,
Interesting.
and you have these so-called red wall seats, which are the Northern England seats, which the Labour Party held for decades because they were solid working class seats, and they were shifting in favor of Conservative. Um, and now it's shifting back to the Labour Party. I mean, I listened to this to the budget speech by the Treasurer, Chancellor of Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, and she's an absolute fiscal hawk, right? I mean, she's basically accusing the predecessor government of having uh, underreported the budget deficit by 22 billion pounds. Then she says we want to be fiscally responsible in government. And so what in effect she's kind of promoting is, austerity right from the beginning. And I was like, well, okay, so you have to consider, I mean, the conservatives, when they came back in power in 2010, that was the first promise to do austerity, massive austerity, and they did. And then people's public services were cut, right? The National Health Service waiting lines were getting longer. The libraries were closing down, and so forth. And And then people were blaming it on the EU, right? They're like, well, we're getting poorer because of the EU, right? This was the framing that was used by the Brexit supporters.
Mm. Yeah.
And so it was a mess that was created ultimately by politics within the Conservative Party. Um, but then it's a big question whether the Labour Party is going to make any positive difference. I mean, are they going to push on the austerity part too hard? Right? Because right now, Keir Starmer's position is that he thinks that he received a popular mandate based on, being a centrist, not on being, radical on the left.
Hmm.
Um,
Oh, we'll see, I guess, what happens in
yeah,
the
because
UK.
there's another asterisk because of Liz Truss, right? Because she was the prime minister for a while and did this mini budget thing. And then there was a run on the pound because basically she introduced unfunded tax cuts to mostly to more affluent people. And once you have a run on the pound, then what happens is the interest rate goes up. And so if you hold a mortgage, right, so it goes from let's say 3% up to 6%, 7%. So now all of a sudden you pay, double for your mortgage, right?
Crazy.
Yeah. So that's really what broke the Tory party, and then the Labour Party is now turning around saying, well, we're going to be more fiscally prudent than the Conservative Party ever was, right? But then it's a big question: can you then push an aggressive, like progressive agenda? Um, and there's a big question mark around that. Um, but some of the programs they do make sense, right? So, for instance, they were saying that they want to loosen the planning regulations. I mean, you remember in the last podcast, the last several ones, where I always keep going back to this like zoning regulation, right? Where if you want to lower the rental cost, you have to deregulate the zoning to some extent. I mean, I just saw the numbers in Austin, Texas, right, where the rents were declining by 7% from last year,
Yeah.
and mainly because of the deregulation of the zoning laws, right? They were saying that you can build more into the height, you know, um, and if you start flooding the space with apartments, um, then the landlords they have to lower the rents if they want to keep the tenants.
Yeah.
Um,
Supply
so
demand. Yeah.
that's right, yeah. So and so I think and so the problem that in Britain and the Tory party, because because the idea of conservatism is basically that they wanted to protect the NIMBY crowd, right? So these are people who are already our homeowners, and they're sitting on quite expensive properties. They're mostly older people, like people above the age of 40, 50, right? Um, and and those were the NIMBYs, right? Those were the ones who they didn't want to change anything with the planning and the zoning regulations. Um, Now the Labour Party is coming in now. They're saying, well, they're not part of our constituency anyway, right? So we're just going to deregulate the planning and the zoning, and
Hmm.
um and so then the idea is, well, okay, more house building, so you have more construction demand. That so you could bring down the unemployment in this way, right?
Yep.
And also you can lower the rental prices, and then that's always going to give a boost to everybody. I mean, to the consumers because they have more money to spend, to also to the business owners themselves because the business rentals are also declining, right? So they can actually expand the business, right? They can hire more people, right? Um, So yeah, it's clearly it's a supply side approach, but I think it is a workable one.
Yeah.
Um, and it's one of the policies that I think the Labour government is doing a good job on. I would like to see public house building as well to compete with the private landlords. Um, but then they were saying, well, we have to be fiscally responsible and everything.
Mm.
So they're not doing that.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
but yeah, again, there's some good to some bad policies, here and there, uh, but yeah, I mean, it is a story of sadness. I mean, the same thing in France, right, where the left coalition, I
Popular
think,
Front. Mhm.
yeah, the NFP, the New Popular Nouveau
Yeah.
Front Populaire Frontière or something, um, and so the left made the right choice with the electoral coalition, right? Because they were saying, well, if you want to prevent the Rassemblement, which is the Le Pen party,
Mhm.
if you want to prevent the right wing from taking over the power, then the left must stop the fracturing and the splintering, right? Because you have to consider that, so the right wing, I mean, they always have a much easier time to stay united than the left wing.
Yeah.
Um, because the right wing, they get a lot of support from like lower middle class people, like security officers, right? Like police officers and military, people who already believe in hierarchy, right?
Conservative.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and they believe in a strong leader, right?
What I found interesting is if you look at the left wing coalition, there's France has these smaller parties, including the Communist Party. There's green parties, there's small left wing parties that decided to join forces as a strategy for the election. But I always found it interesting, like I mean, in Europe, you sometimes have these really small parties. Even Italy has a lot of these small parties. But if you look at for anybody that's listening, but you know more about this than I. But it's just fascinating how many small parties they have in European countries. Often, France in particular, uh, and that was sometimes a disadvantage for them because they had so much fragmentation on the left. You know, so yeah, it worked out for them, I guess.
Yeah, because also like if you think about left and right, so the right says no and the left has to say yes, right? So and what I mean by that is that the right wing, they're conservative, right? Which means that, like, if you throw a new idea at them, they always say no, right? Instinctively, right?
Right.
No, I don't
Status
want to do that. And so
quo, right?
and saying no, it's a much clearer position, right? So you can have one party that represents that view, right?
No to
Um,
immigration.
yeah,
Or
no to immigration.
no new taxes, right?
Yeah, that's right. So this is a much easier position. Now, the progressive side always has a disadvantage because they have to say yes, right? And then the question is, yes to what, right? So, I mean, is it going to be kind of the moderate
Yeah.
left wing, right? So the social democrat, is it going to be like the green version, right? Like environmentalism,
Animal
uh,
rights. Right? Animal rights.
animal rights. Yeah, there's another version of
Vegan,
left wingism.
vegetarianism. Yeah.
Is it going to be like the radical left, right? Is it about like nationalizing companies? So when you say yes, I mean, there's so many ways that you can say yes. Um, and That's why the left has difficulty holding together. Now, the NFP, which was a left wing coalition in France, they were holding together, right?
Mm.
But only for the as an electoral alliance, because now the much harder part comes in because the NFP is now pressuring Emmanuel Macron, the president, to appoint one of the NFP leaders as the prime minister, because
Mm,
because they have a plurality in the parliament. They would work together with the Ensemble, which is the Macron's party,
mm.
and then together NFP and Ensemble, they would have the majority. But
You have to
but
decide on a leader now,
yeah,
huh?
but okay, so who's going to be the leader? And then now Macron is saying, well, we were going to wait until after the Olympics, and then we'll decide who the prime minister is going to be.
Uh,
Um, because I mean, ultimately, I mean, like, I think there's also like this stinging sense of guilt in Macron, right, where he's like he knows that he screwed up by calling for the snap election, right?
mm,
Because ultimately, I mean, his own party was being weakened, right? Um, yeah, I mean, he prevented the Le Pen majority, right? But he also was giving more power to the left itself being so fragmented, and right, where even people within the NFP, right? So the largest bloc within the NFP is Mélenchon, right? Mélenchon is a communist, and Mélenchon says, okay, he's fine with him not serving as the prime minister, right? Because there's opposition within the NFP, right? The socialist, the center left are against him. But then he still wants to have somebody from within his own party, right? Within the Mélenchon camp, the
represented, yeah.
La France Insoumise, right? Um,
Mm,
you know, he wants one of the insiders to become prime minister. So, and
mm,
he would not be happy if there was somebody from the Socialist Party, which is a smaller faction within the NFP, to become prime minister. So it's just much more chaos, effectively,
yeah,
and and French politics is. I mean, I don't know how much you can expect out of that. I mean, next
yeah.
2 years or so, right?
Well, we'll see what happens. It's all good.
Yeah, but okay, but what was happening, I think, in the U.S., I think, is also quite interesting, right? Because we went from basically Trump is going to win a blowout victory to you know
Biden.
Kamala Harris has a very good chance, right? And it was all happening like basically, I mean, like that debate between Trump and Biden, which was at the end of last month.
Yeah,
I think it shifted the trajectory of the entire election season, right?
yeah, pretty much.
Is and then like with the assassination attempt right on Trump, and then he sort of became kind of somewhat more popular. Um, and then now that Biden bowed out of the race, I think that the entire media establishment, I think they're okay with Harris being at the top of the ticket. Um, and I mean, like for me, I mean, it does raise the issue of legitimacy, right? It's like, well, if you did not think that Biden was capable of serving, well, why did he not resign last year so that there would be an open primary process
Yeah,
in which it could be the case that at that point that Harris would have still stitched up the nomination. But but now okay, so now they were saying, well, okay, we're going to wait until the end. Now with the debate, and now that the DNC is coming up, so now they're going to put Harris through the nomination process. So I think that's a part of the Democratic Party has to be concerned about. But I mean, but with respect to the overall agenda, right? Um, I would say that I mean especially, I mean, for us, like within higher education, I mean, we definitely want to see, a democratic administration. I mean, and you know, and I like it is a big concern. Like, what would happen? I mean, if you let Trump back in again, right? I mean, is he willing to leave office after that term is over? Um, you know, is he going to do too much, protectionism again, right?
Mhm.
Um, is he going to be able to seal the border hermetically, right?
There's
Um,
a lot of questions. Yeah. Oh,
yeah, so that's why I mean, I think it's a somewhat higher risk proposition to have Trump back in. I'm also concerned about like what's his position on NATO, what's the position on Ukraine and Taiwan, and I mean because you see, if you have a lot of fires that are happening, you know, we like you want to have somebody who can sort of stabilize the current alliances. Um,
you want to
which
be
I
a
mean,
wild card, huh? You
yeah,
don't want a
because
wild card.
there's going to be people who are going to say, well, we should stop this U.S. imperialism. We should let Russia and China do whatever they want and stuff. I mean, okay. I mean, I, I don't know whether I don't know whether it's a better world. I mean, I'd be very concerned about that prospect.
Yeah.
So
But don't forget the Senate and House of Representatives. Isn't it voting? The Senate, there could be a change in the Senate too. So we don't know exactly the impact. But trying to remember if the House, are there some House candidates that are also up for this election? I can't remember. Isn't it like every 2 years the House? I know there's senatorial. There's a concern about the Senate too. I mean, which way the Senate's going to go, not just presidential politics, but the Senate. So I don't
yeah,
know. We'll see what happens. It's
yeah. I
90
mean,
days
there's
till the
yeah,
election.
yeah. I mean, I think I mean so the with Congress, I'm not sure. I mean, ideally, I mean, you want to have like a single party that rules. Uh, but but ultimately, I mean, like the system was kind of designed to be inefficient, right?
Yeah. Uh,
Um, you want to slow things down in the process.
check,
Um,
checks in place.
yeah.
Power. Yeah.
Now there was
Power
this
checks.
interesting proposal that I saw this morning by the Biden administration where they were saying that there should be term limits and ethics guidelines for Supreme Court justices, and that presidents should be prosecutable. Um, and this is kind of a direct response to um, kind of the concerns that I think that the left has had about these two institutions, right? Where basically, okay, you allow like a convicted felon like Trump to basically stand above the law, not be punished or prosecuted. And then also you allow like a Supreme Court justice like Clarence Thomas to collect bribes from um,
Rich donor. Rich.
rich
Yeah.
donors, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so this is, and then also the concern about like you know very consequential rulings like Dobbs v. Jackson, right, which was about repealing the federal protections in abortion. Um, and it kind of the left kind of sees, well, these are all issues that were abused by the so-called right wing, um, and those institutional tweaks would be necessary in order to prevent those things from happening again in the future. I think that's kind of
Uh,
how how the Biden administration thinks about it. Um, but I mean, so my take is that I mean, I think it's a reasonable intervention. Yeah, I think that Supreme Court justices, I think there should be um, a term limit, right?
Mhm.
Because because their powers it's very consequential. I mean, I think in some cases, right?
Very, very consequential.
Um,
Something else I never realized is the U.S. Supreme Court, they don't allow cameras. And it's an old taboo. It's something that they have power over deciding, cameras in the courtroom, stuff like that. Whereas I think of other constitutional courts or Supreme Courts, like the German Supreme Court, they do have cameras. I think the Austrian too. They have cameras, and some people have advocated for reforms. Why does the U.S. Supreme Court have this old rule that you can't have cameras uh, in the Supreme Court? And that's why they still do these audio recordings. When you get a Supreme Court decision, you have the pictures. People draw cartoons or something, like a cartoonish picture, because the U.S. Supreme Court prohibits cameras. That's interesting. Must be an old rule, I guess. But around, like I said, there's other cases where Supreme Courts do allow cameras. Now that's a different kind of reform. I don't know, that's not like putting limitation on how long someone can be a Supreme Court justice or expanding the court. Those are other issues. But I always thought that one's interesting. Why can't they have cameras in the Supreme Court? I mean,
yeah,
even the International Criminal Justice Court has it, I think, right? Well, they have cameras when they make, but I didn't understand that. Well, what the reasoning or rationale was for that.
yeah, I think cameras make sense. Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
certainly not against it. And yeah, I did see. I think it was like liberal congressman. I think Ed Markey was it proposed to appoint 4 more justices, so to expand the Supreme Court to 13. I'm against that proposal, um, because then it will never stop, right? So
yeah.
you have the
It'll go to
Democrats again
30.
in power, it's 13. Then the Republicans are in power, then it goes to 20, right?
Yeah.
And then it goes to like 40 and 50 and whatever, Um,
In
and
Austria, isn't it the case that they have multiple courts? Like there's like I know in Germany they have like two cabinets of supreme justices. Is that the case? Do you know in Austria? Do they just have one high Supreme Court and it's made up of, I don't know, 12 people or something? And then they have a second chamber that's another, and they trade schedules or something. I'll have to look into that, whether that's the case. But I think Germany, it's the case. They have like multiple chambers in
yeah,
the.
there's different chambers, right?
Uh,
So you have
I'm trying to think of it. I'll have to double check to make sure what I'm saying is correct. But
I think it was
uh,
like Oberstes Gerichtshof, and then there's like Verwaltungsgerichtshof. So I mean, so there's
uh,
different kind of
huh,
institutions that deal
yeah,
with different
yeah.
legal cases. Um, but yeah, I mean,
So even the legal systems are sometimes different, organized differently.
well, so the Germanic system is similar to, I think, the French one, right? Which
Yeah.
is built on this Code Napoleon, right? Where the idea is that basically the government sets like the law, like the formal legal cases, and the judges would have to interpret the legal cases based on adherence to these state laws and regulations. Um, and then the American system is based on the British system, which is based on court precedents. So here, I mean, a court precedent is basically another way of saying that the judges are the ones who write the law, right? because the judges, they pronounce a judgment, which is their interpretation of what they think is right or wrong. And then the future judges, they will then, themselves selectively cite the precedent that is suitable to argue their claim, right?
Mhm.
So
At that time,
basically,
yeah. Yeah.
yeah, more power to the judges, right? That's kind of
Okay.
the
Yeah.
common law system, right? And
Okay.
then the civil laws, the Court of Napoleon, right?
Uh,
And
go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, I think most countries go according to the civil law system, which I think is a little bit easier, right? Uh,
Yeah.
because you write down the law once, and then basically you need the judges to interpret whether the case fits that specific law, right?
Mm.
Um, yeah. So yeah, these are just different, legal traditions. Um, but then the idea that the constitutional court would be able to declare whole laws invalid. Not every country has that kind of judicial review system. I think the U.S. was actually one of the pioneers, right? This Marbury versus Madison case.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
This was, the U.S. setting the precedent with judicial review, and
Definitely. Yeah. Long history.
yeah, so they have had that, and look, I mean, so I'm not gonna argue against like the judicial review principle, because if you have a legal system that's been in place for a long time, you know, now some people say you can have something for a long time and it's still bad, right?
Mm.
In which case you should definitely remove it, right? So let's say if you had laws about slavery, right, legalizing that, well, I mean, clearly it's a bad law. I mean, you should definitely remove that law and stuff. Um, but I mean, in a case like judicial review, I mean, you're like, well, is that is that a bad system, to have? I don't know. I mean, it sounds fine to me.
Well, it's necessary for the separation of powers, you know. So you have separated powers. And not one institution has too much power. Montesquieu, right? Spirit of the law.
Yeah, that's right. That's
Theor-
right. Yeah.
on paper, theoretically, it's supposed to work this way, you know, separated powers.
That's for sure. Yeah.
Praxis is probably different. uh,
That's for sure. Yeah. Yeah. So,
uh,
it does make sense. But then again, well, what if you have, a right wing majority, right? Where, this like, yeah, but then, if you look at the historical cases, right, you could also have, a left leaning majority, right? So certainly, Brown versus Board of Education, right? I mean, there's very important cases that went to the Supreme Court and they made the country more progressive. And I don't think there's anybody who would now explicitly go out of his way to say, we should, legally resegregate those schools, right? Now, I mean, you could make the argument that, you know, that some, you know, school districts might be pursuing that, indirectly, through, like redlining or something like that.
yeah.
But but at least like on a formal legal basis, I mean, you cannot really argue the case for like racially segregation, right? Um, and that suggests that like some of the progressive reforms that have been put in place, since the civil rights era, I mean, are not reversible, which I think, is positive, right? But again, on a topic, I mean, if it comes to like abortion, yeah, I mean, this is an issue where this kind of keeps coming back again, right? it's about
What would
control,
you
I suppose.
describe it? Like a regressive backlash or regressive policies that shift back in time? Would that be a phrase like regressive move? Because we use the word progressive, we're thinking like progressive liberal. But if we use the word regressive, there's a return to previous time or uh, that go back to prior civil rights era. So I guess the word regressive. I would use the word regressive, but regressive judicial decisions or something, or would that be a phrase appropriate? I guess.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there's a regressive logic for sure. I mean,
yeah.
I think, and and it's very hard to get around it. I mean, but I mean, again, I go back to the Bernie Sanders argument that, like, I think that some issues, like, they have to be bracketed, and we have to focus on kind of like the high priority areas. I mean, it could be things like um, economic rights, right?
Uh,
Again, going back to the beginning of the discussion, like UBI,
Housing.
right?
Yeah, yeah,
Um, social
yeah,
policies, social programs.
yeah, yeah,
Generally there's a tendency to expand social programs. It's very hard to cut these programs, right? Um, and yeah, kind of building on those things, right?
yeah,
Things that can bring people together more than divide them, right?
yeah.
Uh,
What are you there?
yeah, because people who are like, well, okay, I'm strongly, pro-gun. I'm strongly anti-abortion. I mean, I'm like, yeah, I mean, it's like there's no like reasoned discourse, right? Because
Culture
it's not
wars.
about reasoned
Yeah,
discourse. I mean, it's about like my side is right, your side is wrong, and I want to get my case in government
yeah.
law, right? Um,
Culture wars. Yeah,
yeah, it's a culture war, and I mean, it's to some extent. I mean, it is a death trap, so to some extent, in terms of public discourse,
yeah.
because you cannot progress on those lines, right? Um, and it seems like, I mean, so you see in American history, I mean, the thing that sort of glued us together is money, right? It's like this idea that, like, you can earn more money, right, just by moving here, right? The country of immigration. You move here, you become better off, like your children become better off, right? Um, and
Reward society, right?
yeah, I
Yeah.
mean,
Forward.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, there's this idea of like opportunity, um, which, like, and this is the thing about, I mean, I don't want to be like jingoistic American here, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I mean, this idea of like opportunity, right? Um, it's more real in this country than in most other countries, right? Like, if you have like a big idea where it's like, okay, I want to make it here. Now, I mean, then you can make the counter argument with like social mobility data, which shows that actually it's much harder to be upwardly socially mobile in the US than in some other countries. Because, if you don't have the resources and then you don't have a welfare state, then there's just no way to get ahead, right?
Yeah.
But at least the historic argument, and certainly, I mean, for the new immigrants, right? Like, if you're like a new immigrant, I mean, maybe not so much like, because we come from, Austria, Germany, where it's
Yeah.
already pretty well off. But if you came, let's say, if you grew up in a global South country, right, and then you make it across to the U.S. and you're like, oh man, life is so much better over here, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And then
There.
you're just like, this is,
Economic opportunity. Yeah.
yeah, this is the
Business.
benefit, yeah, of being here.
Um,
Um,
yeah.
and that's where, and that's the glue. I mean, historically, I mean, that's the glue, right, behind America. I mean, It was sort of like because there's a lot of baggage with regard to like race relations and ethnic stuff. But the thing that could put people together is like, well, okay, we're all united around being better off economically. Um, but it's not a reliable glue as it once was, right? Because I mean, there's a perception that like there is downward social mobility. I mean, if you go back to this AI issue again, right? Where I think I shared this article about the game developers who are replaced by AI because you can ask AI to like uh like draft like the characters in those games, right? And you can design like how are they moving, how they acquire weapons, how they acquire points, and so forth, right?
There's this ambivalence character to it, right? Double-edged sword. Have you ever read Seymour Lipset, American Exceptionalism? Curious, have you ever read that one before? That kind
Yeah,
of
I've heard
goes
of
into
that.
this. It's a kind of thesis. America is special. America, you know, is different from all the other countries, which partly explains the opportunities, but also there's an ambivalence to this American exceptionalism thesis that there's, it's a double-edged sword. It has two sides to it, like a coin. A coin has two sides to it. So on the one hand, I mean, you have a land of opportunity, innovation, land of Apple, I mean, the computer company of Tesla, of Walmart. On the other hand, you also have historical conflict and historical violence and other issues, inequality. So I guess that makes the U.S. unique. It's a kind of ambivalence. It has these characteristics that make America great, right? This exceptionalism idea. On the other hand, you got this historical conflict, the divide, and you know, so yeah, that's two sides of the coin, I guess I'm getting at. But Lipset wrote that book. It was quite interesting. I was trying to remember some of the core arguments, but it had this idea of American exceptionalism, like idea which a lot of people also embraced. People thought that this was a the new world, new opportunities. It's not feudalistic. It's very much individualistic opportunity structures. There's a lots of vast amount of land available. I think that's where that Wild West idea came to. Like plenty of land for everybody, right?
Yeah, the Wild West is a historical argument, right?
Yeah,
So I would say
yeah.
that by
But
about
everybody was
1890, I think it was finished.
but you remember everybody was offered even land if you were a white European. You were offered land to come. You were they were actually handing out land to people to harvest the land. And now when you think about land, it's more challenging to own land, including challenging to own property and houses. Because I think the land is pretty much gobbled up now, right? so, uh, so that lots of things have changed the last 100 years, I would say. But still, that American exceptionalism thesis is still noticeable, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
and I mean it is a very powerful narrative because it pulls in so many people, right?
yeah.
And it's still the case. I mean, because if you make a decision to migrate, I think it's a very, very big decision to make. But there's many people who have made that jump,
Yeah.
and that suggests that that there is something that this land offers to people. Certainly a much uh, lower barriers for some, right, than for others. And Yeah, I mean it's a good it's an interesting experiment. But again, it's like if you make it all about the economic success story, right? Then there's going to be downside vulnerability where if you disappoint those expectations, then the entire order could unravel, right? I mean,
Mhm.
like if you think about like let's say the European countries, right? So they're, you know, also rich countries, right? But but they have less of a like this internal drive to kind of like develop their own like, version of Apple or Google or whatever. Um, they're also okay largely with economic stagnation, right? I mean, it's not perfect because if you have too much economic stagnation, right? You have AFD, you have FPO, you have kind of right wing forces, you have Le Pen, right? So it's not perfect. I mean, it's kind of also starting to unravel around the edges, right? Um, but I always have a feeling that like if your economy is stagnating, right? And but if we still have some amount of welfare state, right? Like where you don't allow people to go completely hungry, completely homeless, right? Um, where it's like I think people can sort of manage that situation, right? Um, and also this idea of like not having upward social mobility. I think the Europeans are much more accepting of that idea, right? Like if like say if you're born into a lower middle class family, right? And if you're just about to manage and you keep that position, you're like, well, that sounds fine to me, right?
Do you
Um,
think that explains why Europeans are more happier to be renters, rather than a homeowner, being a owner of a home, not just because of the price, but it's more common for people to rent and sometimes even live with their parents until the age of 40 or 45, that it's seen as okay, well, it's okay to rent. Why do you have to own a house and pay the mortgage for 40, 50 years? In Europe, it'd probably be worse. It might even take longer for the average person to own a home. I think it's usually passed down through inheritance. But renting is more, you see renting more common, like people are renters for life almost. And I think back in Germany, there's so more renters than in the US. US, you still have a lot of people that own homes, or have mortgages. There's renters too, but not that many renters. You know what I mean by renters, not people that are getting a pension. I mean people that are renting um, apartments, things like that,
yeah, so
or
I'll say that there's probably like more rental protections, right, in
yeah,
the European countries as well, right?
yeah.
Where you might be able to limit rent rises, and I think then I mean, because I mean, I'm a renter myself here, and it's like, okay, if something goes wrong, you call up the landlord, fix the roof or whatever that you have wrong in the building, and so and there's definitely a comfort factor right there. But yeah, I think that's definitely a factor. I mean, the idea that you know like your social role is not changing, right? Um, I think most societies work like that, like that
Yeah.
the social roles are stable across time, and people are accepting
Continuity.
of that.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's right.
continuity. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, versus I mean, I think the people that come to America, I mean, I think they want to see change. They want to see improvements. They want to get better off. Um, and of course, and the desire is much stronger the more recent of a migrant you are. So, the desire to succeed is the strongest for the first generation. It's a little bit weaker in the second generation, and then it gets weaker as there's more generations added on. Um, yeah, and yeah, versus yeah, I mean in Europe, yeah, I mean you do have a lot of first, second gen migrants nowadays, probably at the same rate as the U.S. Um, I mean, one thing you do notice is that there's less of a conscious steering towards like high human capital, right? So, you know, like in France, you have like North African migrants. I mean, in Germany, you have Turkish, right? Austria, the same. So there might be less of a migration of like the people that are, the Silicon Valley types, right? The people that would develop, iPhones or whatever. You know, they're less likely to be appealed to go to those countries. It's kind of like a general labor migration. So you have like the construction industry, which absorbs a lot of the migrant labor. You have like entertainment, right? Like the hotels and hospitality and
S-
yeah, that's where a lot of the jobs are being created, right?
Yeah. I notice Europe still gets a lot more university students too. I mean, that come from international countries. They have larger student populations, but like you think of North America, I mean, Canada probably has more international students than the United States. I think I don't know the
You
numbers
mean per
exactly.
capita, right?
Yeah, there's been a decline of less and less international students that go to attend universities in the U.S. Then like 20, 30 years ago, let's say, what I can remember now. But I think in Europe, there's an appeal often. Not all European countries, though. I mean, if there's seemingly hostility or negative attitudes, there seems to be a decline of international students wanting to attend, such universities. I know with Brexit became a lot difficult for international students
Well,
to
but
even
it would be
attend.
difficult for the
Yeah,
European students. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah,
I think that the like if you're
yeah,
like Nigerian or Indian or Chinese, I
yeah.
think it's still very
Poland,
attractive.
for instance, Poland, for instance, yeah, or Hungary, even I think. So yeah, challenging to be an international student in some countries, yeah, European countries, and yeah,
Yeah, we do have a lot of international students here. Probably the balance is shifting, right? So it's shifting more
so
towards India rather than China.
yeah,
China for a while was top sending country, and now I think there's all of this like Cold War hostility, right?
yeah,
Where there's the accusation that oh, they're working for the Chinese government. The Chinese government is the U.S. adversary, and so and with that, I mean, I find it very unfortunate
yeah,
because the Chinese students who are coming here, I mean, like I'm not saying that there's no nationalists at all, right? Chinese nationalists or
yeah,
those close to the CCP, but I mean, but I would say that this group is like relatively speaking the most open-minded, right? The ones that you know that want to expose themselves to like different
yeah. Good,
viewpoints,
good
you know,
programs, academic programs. Yeah,
yeah, different political views and different
yeah,
ideas that they want to learn. And so and I think also like the people exchange is so important, right?
yeah,
Um, I mean, like ourselves, I mean, like we are unwittingly, I mean, we're like the cultural ambassadors of like Central Europe, more or less.
yeah, yeah,
In our podcast, I mean, but that's just because of where we grew up, right? I mean, yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah.
and
One thing I always seen that there was always a lack of international faculty uh, represented, unless you go to an Ivy League, international faculty outside of the global north, it's really rare, like you have international faculty even in the social sciences, like unless it's an Ivy League school. But I try to remember back when I went to school and all that, it was usually just regional people from the region that they got their university degrees, sometimes outside of the region, but hardly ever outside of the country, unless there's one case where someone got a degree outside of the country of origin. And the same thing in Germany. In Germany, like if you think of a lot of the university professors, there's very few that are non-German and often male, white male. So. It's still, yeah, diversity issue when it comes to faculty and who makes it as a professor, like at the big universities, especially teaching social science or history, things like history or other fields. So I always notice that. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
well, I mean,
another topic. Yeah, another can of worms.
right. I mean, like if you're from a global South country, I mean, I
Yeah.
think that there's a lot of pressure. Like if you wanted to become, faculty, if you wanted to study an academic subject, there's a lot of pressure to go to the lucrative fields. So,
Yeah.
like, medicine and engineering and,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
um,
Nothing
like
social
business
science.
school.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think social sciences, I mean, it's really like, I mean, the people who study it, like, they have to really love the field, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like, by loving, I mean, just the way how you and I mean, we're very much in the social sciences. We found something, our
Yeah.
calling in it, right?
Our we found a niche. Yeah. Our yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, it's really like
Yeah.
what Weber called Berufung, right? I mean, that's the
Yeah.
original term was coined by Weber. Um, and I think that this is really a matter of like luxury, right? So that's to say, like if if you're well off enough, I think then you could contemplate studying it. Um, Now I don't come from a very well off family, but at least I was given the scholarship, so in that in that sense I was made well off. And so then you're able to
Pursue it. Yeah.
yeah, pursue liberal arts and stuff like that. I remember there was this one interview that I read by my mentor Alejandro Portes, and he was saying that, like, he was comparing like Latin American sociology with with North American one, and he basically says that sociology as a field can only thrive if you have a free society, right? I mean, like liberal democratic society, like in the truest sense of the term, right? Because in any kind of authoritarian setting, well, you might have a faculty of sociology, right? But it's going to be very circumscribed, and it's
Marginalized.
only
Yeah.
yeah. So you'll only be able to study exactly the things that the government gives you as an opening, right? So it would be things like, I don't know, educational completion rates or something like that, right? So maybe something very technocratic, right, and narrow.
Yeah.
Um, and and usually it's a mark of the really wealthy country. I mean, even within um, Europe, right? I mean, if you look at this kind of divide, right? Where basically if you go further south and east in Europe, um, you don't have thriving liberal arts programs, quite frankly. I mean, the best ones would probably be like, Swedish sociology. I think you studied in Sweden before,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Lund University and stuff, Stockholm,
Uppsala. Yeah.
Uppsala. Yeah, they got some good programs there.
Denmark too,
In
by the way.
Denmark, they've got good programs.
Nordic. Yeah. A lot of Nordic countries
In the Nordic
invest.
countries, and of course the
Yeah.
UK, which is
Yeah.
traditionally like very university friendly
London School of
place.
Economics, right?
That's right. Yeah, yeah,
Cambridge.
yes.
Cambridge too.
Um,
Yeah.
Also the Dutch, interestingly, I mean, they have good universities in Amsterdam and
French. France. Yeah.
Rotterdam. France to some extent, yeah, Germany, of course. But I get, yeah, right. So you see the pattern, right? So they're
Yeah.
wealthy, right? And in terms of even the liberal democratic spectrum, I think they're probably would be the highest in that regard. And
Yeah.
they are the ones that then also have the most flourishing, relatively speaking, social science departments.
Yeah.
So, so we are really like, like
Who
we are
would
basically the
who?
artists, right?
Oh, the artist.
Yeah, the artists in the family. I mean, the artists within a rich family, right? Like you always notice, like I think it was the Koch brothers, right?
Yeah,
Where there were like the two famous brothers. One of them passed away. I think it was so David Koch is the older brother. I think he's still alive.
right, right.
And then there's Charles Koch is the older brother. And then David Koch passed away. And I think there's a third guy named I think Frederick Koch. I think, and he's the artist in the family. He's the art collector. So
Mm.
he never made his fingers dirty in the business, right? Of the family. He's
Just
the
get it
art
through
collector.
inheritance. Yeah, just get it through inheritance. Yeah.
Yeah, he's the one through the inheritance, and he was
Yeah.
able to pursue his passion.
Yeah.
And so within a rich family, we are the spoiled artists, so to speak, right?
That's a good way to end it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
All right.
okay. And actually, that brings us back to this
Okay.
to what we said at the very beginning, right?
Oh, that picture. You mean that picture? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
UBI, where the sleazeball that don't want to do any work, left wing academics.
And yeah, that's probably what it is. The people on the left here, right? And yeah, I mean, okay, so I have to say, I'm not a good representative of my field, I suppose, in terms of like the sociology department should not hire me for PR campaigns, I
Right,
suppose,
right.
to make them look better. Um, but anyway, so
Yeah.
okay, so
All
then
right.
we'll conclude the podcast
Con-
here. So thank you very
Okay.
much, Mike, for joining
Yeah, it
in.
was great. We'll do it again. Definitely.